Alright, draft science video, edition 2. I try to be more specific, go through the postulates and try to explain context. Yeah, well, let us begin. These first three are really quite connected, so we'll try to buzz through them. But the universe is made of two fundamental elements, the vast nothing and energetic quanta, energy photons moving the speed of light. So I think there's probably nothing smaller than the photon, nothing lesser to build out of. And but just in case, let's just say the photons are made out of something. This something is the smallest bits. Those bits do something even simpler than photons do, but it really doesn't matter. So anyway, photons can be considered a form of energetic quanta as they possess the fundamental native property of straight line momentum at the speed of light. So photons and empty space, that's all there is. There's fish and there's seawater, and that's all there is. And the fish only move one speed and never stop. They just keep going 30 miles an hour, let's say. But the speed of light is, for the photons, the thing, and they just do that in a straight line until something tells them, unless they interact with some other fish in some other configuration, that where either they join the configuration and another fish is expelled, or they are changed in their orientation or direction based on the interaction. But in that process, no energy can be transferred. So if you understand the fish to be the fundamental energy, I guess I could draw it as a fish or the photon, and that when two fish encounter each other, they are fundamentally, all there are is energy. So whatever goes in, fish has to come out. Fish has to come out this way, and a fish comes out this way, but it has to be a fish. So there's no consumption of energy ever in the fundamental mechanism of the universe. The photons never absorb or use energy. They only change in terms of their direction based on the interaction they have with something. So at its core, there's no use of energy. There's just fish moving, and you just change the patterns of how they're moving. That's all there really is. You change the direction that the fish are moving. All matter, or mass, is composed entirely of energetic quanta trapped in circular, perhaps perpetually redundant patterns of light speed movement. So we know that atoms have these parts to them, and these parts are made out of photons, I would argue. And some of these parts are quite durable, so sort of what I meant by perpetually redundant here is some of these parts are like fundamental parts, because they're not going to degrade or fall apart or in some way be destroyed in most natural process. So they're kind of durable. Where they're created or how they're created is complicated and is a cosmic feature, the big universe. But regardless, they're created, and atoms are made that way. But the constituent parts are still photons, and so there's just a certain number, a certain percentage of the fish in the sea are freely swimming, and a certain percentage are locked in schools of fish. You could argue it that way, and who knows what that proportion is. But some percentage of the fish in the schools can be migrated, can be transferred or converted from school fish to free fish. So that's really the difference between loose energy and bound energy, or potential energy and kinetic energy. Alright, so here's the relativity bit that I've added, number 4. Moving matter, any velocity, requires a change in net directional movement of the photons that comprise it. This changing of directional momentum is absolute and slows down atomic metabolism and creates the phenomenon of time dilation. So the key words here are absolute rather than relative, and the idea of atomic metabolism. So let's just scoot up to this image of the fish swimming. So you can sort of see in this idea of a school of fish swimming that there would be a, if this pattern was extended to be a figure 8, you could understand that if you were to migrate that, move that figure 8, that there would be some consumption of extra distance by these fish. They would be now swimming more distance as they moved in a direction. And to swim that more distance, they would have to swim this distance. It would take longer for them to swim this distance. So that one little step they take out here, that one little step will slow them down in this process. And so as they move faster, as you oblige the figure 8 or the pattern to move or have velocity as matter, that velocity comes at the price of slowing down the metabolism of the center structure of this pattern. So atoms, the electrons, the whole metabolism of an atom is slowed down when you oblige that atom to move. And that explains the dilation of time in the sense that the metabolism of any clock you create will run slower as you start to accelerate it. I would argue that that is an absolute condition, and that the higher the greater the velocity, the more you're slowing down the metabolism of the atoms, and the more likely you are to degrade at some point the function of the atoms. So what binds atoms together is loose and isn't as strong a force. So if this was a complex arrangement of say hydrogen, and it was an oxygen molecules tied to it, then you would have a circumstance where this is, the faster you start moving it, the slower these fish start moving. The relative to their movement, now all the radiation coming in from other sources has the appearance of being of a higher energy, of a higher frequency. So from their perspective, things coming in now will affect them more energetically as they slow down. And this would mean that atoms that were durable in, say, visible light would all of a sudden start to degrade because the visible light is now becoming ultraviolet light. There's more energy they're being impacted because of their velocity, and in a new way, in a more energetic way, that won't allow the molecular structure to be sustained. So I would speculate, I would predict that no complex matter will survive very high velocities. Anything approaching a quarter or a half of the speed of light would be impossible for chemical matter, and at some point you will start to degrade elements themselves. The more complex elemental matter will start to degrade the higher the velocity. The bigger atoms probably won't survive. So anyway, moving on. I don't think we need more here. So we take the metabolism idea, the idea that atoms have a metabolism, they have a structure, a pattern, and that the pattern is slowed down when you obligate it to move, because the pieces inside the pattern are already moving the speed of light, and so the extra distance has to consume extra time. They can't move faster, so they have to move slower to move more distance. In a sense, slower in the sense that the pattern has to be completed slower. And its velocity is absolute, not relative. Alright, electrons can absorb photons, or they can exchange changes in directional momentum without transferring energy. So a transfer of energy might look like, say this was a bit of matter, an electron or an atom, which doesn't really matter. And the idea would be that, that's not a very good fish. The idea would be that, let's say 3 fish could go in, I gotta figure out a way to draw these fish fast. You know, 3 fish could go in and 2 fish could go out. So that 1 fish got absorbed in the process. So something like ultraviolet light goes in, infrared light comes out. And so there's a transfer of energy and also a transfer in direction. So the momentum of these 3 fish goes in this way. The atom or the electron or the whatever might move a little bit this way, you know, the whole school, and you might have 2 fish leave this way. But it's all kinetic, so it's all the momentum is retained in the sense that what's really happening is the fish here are kinetically reacting to the fish that come in, and there's a kinetic opposite and equal reaction that takes place in terms of a direction change. But if the energy is absorbed, if a fish is absorbed, the atom itself will have to in some way eat that change in direction in terms of its structure. And how that usually would take place is in, one could argue, in the ellipsing of orbits. And as the orbits of an atom become elliptical, because everything moves the same speed, because this orbit is all the same speed, and there can't be any speed direction, there would be a tendency for it to wobble in this direction. So it would wobble in a direction as it spun. And so the energy, the fish going in, can convert the atom into, can change the direction of its energy in terms of its own orbital energy, can be stationary or wobble. So in a sense, you could argue that a school of fish can have much chaos in how the fish move, and that would represent a certain amount of net fish moving a net amount of distance, but they're moving all this distance in circular patterns that don't go anywhere, and it represents exactly the same amount of energy is being done, the same amount of work is being done if all the fish moved in the same direction. So even though when all the fish are moving in the same direction, it appears more like more energy, it's the same amount of energy, it's just now directed. Instead of directed in all directions, it's directed in one direction. Yeah, this might be understandable. So anyway, the relationship between electrons and photons is pretty much everything that we call the active universe. Is the interaction between photons and electrons. Photons don't interact with photons, as far as I can tell, as far as I know, and that the only way they can interact with another, the only way a fish can interact with another fish, so free fish don't really interact with each other. So when they meet each other, they just don't do anything. They just go past each other, it would appear. And the real game is that when the fish are locked in this pattern, when they're tied to each other, that's when a fish can interact with a fish. That's when they can kinetically exchange directional information or be absorbed by the school or expelled by the school. Alright. 6. The universe exerts an evenly distributed photonic pressure proportional to its mass. Material objects can shield other objects from this pressure and create gravitational attraction. So the subject of gravity I'll do a whole video on, yeah, the idea is is that all parts of the universe are exerting. There's a ton of free photons throughout the whole universe, free fish. And because the fish aren't associated with each other, because they're not in a frequency, in a pattern, where there's a period between the fish, a frequency, a wavelength, fish like that will not be recognized by most matter in terms of absorbing energy or doing anything. There's light that's visible to our eye and light that's invisible to our eye. And that's because each atom and each molecular configuration has a different sensitivity to a different vibration, different things will make something tip over, different amounts of energy brought to it the right way. So you can, again, understand a tipping point where you can, depending on the weight and the center of gravity of an object, each object, depending on how its mass and how it's configured and how it's aligned, would tip over based on a different amount of energy poked at it in a different cycle, where you would want to be pushing things when they're at its weakest point. So you'd want to push it once, let it swing back maybe, and then push it again when it's on its cycle going the other way, to maximize the effect of the energy of the push. If you push when it's going back, when you try to push on this pen as it's coming back, the push force would be neutralized. Where if it's moving in the opposite direction, you maximize the ability to tip it over. And so then atoms have a similar mechanism, in the sense that they're sensitive to certain kinds of frequencies or periods of fish arriving. So if the fish arrive at a certain frequency, a certain amount of distance between, or time between each fish arriving, they will have their movement or their vibration changed, or they will even be, an electron will be pushed out of its capture by an atom by that certain frequency, and some other frequency of impacts won't push it out because it won't be consistent with its own vibration. So it's all vibration sensitive. So there could be photons flying around you, going through you right now, that there's no way your atomic structure would find them interesting, because they essentially have a neutral effect on a neutral force effect, in the sense that they aren't absorbed. So all they can do is perhaps create directional pressure. So a function also to understand about your velocities, when you have, so inertia and velocity is part of the subject of gravity, but it's something to understand in terms of the fact that your matter has a configuration, and when you're moving somewhere, it's not because something's pushed you and you just keep going for some unknown zero reason. You keep going because the matter inside of you has been reoriented by the force. Being impacted creates an orientation in the pattern, and so you can kind of think of it as a bunch of gyroscopes. Electrons could possibly be thought of as a bunch of gyroscopes, and if those gyroscopes have any ellipse in their orbit, any unevenness, that would create a wobble in their orbit, and that wobble could have a direction. It would tend to have a direction on a plane and in a direction. And certainly the fish, if they were a bunch of free fish swimming, they would constantly be, they could constantly be changing the direction of that wobble. So it could be wobbling in this direction, and fish hits it and it wobbles in this direction, and fish hits it and it wobbles in that direction. So with each, with the fish flowing through it, would keep changing the orientation of a wobble just because of those interactions. And so what's basically happened when you have velocity is that the wobble of more of your atoms or your electrons is in the same direction. So while 99% are still in all directions, there's this extra plus percent in this one direction, and this ends up being a net, pressure in a direction, and you end up moving. So when there is an essential balance in the pressure and in the orientations of the gyroscopes, you don't go anywhere. All you do is vibrate or shake based on the frequencies of the atoms in a very, on the most minute scale of your structure. When theoretically, when you're moving, what's happening is a tiny percentage of those gyroscopes have now been oriented in one direction, and as that percentage increases, your velocity increases. Your body eats more space. So it's just a way of thinking of what happens with gravity is that these photons go through you, And in places where there's no photons going through you, if there's a spot that's dead or clear of photons coming into you, there would be a net pressure imbalance that would tend to configure the end net configuration of your net material structure would be movement in that direction then, because they're not getting realigned out of that direction. So you can almost think of it as a negative force in the sense that it's not so much about being forced into an alignment, it's about not being knocked out of an alignment. It's not a hard way to, it's not an easy way to draw that, but it's not so much that the side you end up going to ends up being the default because there's no chaos in that direction. There's no constant re-changing of direction in that one direction, which means it'll tend to go in that direction because that direction is not changed. It's free from being directed. And that's the nature of acceleration and velocity, and the nature of gravity in the end. So gravity is a function of this pressure being exerted on all sides of a body, and just understanding that if you have two bodies close to each other, or in proximity to each other, that this body would be shielding, casting a shadow on this body, and that shadow of pressure would tend to make this body move in that direction because there's no reorientation pressure coming this way. So it's the lack of pressure that creates the acceleration and the attraction. So the attraction isn't a positive force, it's the absence of the negative pressure. It's the absence of the reorientation pressure, and which allows the body to have more of its gyroscopes in the direction of the movement. Yeah, alright, so that's probably enough for the simple description. This is a sage theory that was came up with in the 1700s, and it was discounted for reasons of heat, which wouldn't be a problem if you understand the kinetic nature of the fish and the fact that they can change each other's direction without any transfer of energy. Again, that needs to be understood. That heat is created when atoms absorb fish, when the atoms get bigger and smaller because they keep absorbing and emitting fish. That's the nature of heat. And there's no necessity that heat be created in directional interactions. So if the fish are only changing direction by interacting with each other, one fish goes off this way, the other fish goes that way, there's no heat because they were both in the environment already. There was only two fish moving the speed of light, and the only thing that's changed is the direction they're moving. That interaction would create no heat. It would be a heat neutral. Heat's only when you free legacy fish, when you convert potential fish, potential energy of their matter. When you convert matter into energy is when you create heat. And there's no necessity to do that in photons still being able to interact with each other without doing that. There's clearly ways that can take place. And the other argument was the problem of momentum in empty space, let's say. If these photons that have this capacity to change our momentum exist in all of space, then why wouldn't they deter velocity or degrade velocity? Why wouldn't they be a force you have to always push against even when gravity isn't in play? And the reason for that is that as the interactions become more kinetic, the clearest way to understand it, I think, is to understand that if two fish were pool balls and they crashed directly into each other, there would be no net change in the universe. After the interaction and before the interaction, everything would be exactly the same. There'd be a cue ball going this way and a cue ball going this way, and after the interaction, exactly the same circumstance exists. And nothing changes in the universe when it's a direct impact. And so that fact that there is no directional change, the more direct the impact, indicates that when your velocity is going the same way as the pressure, that there is no pressure. The pressure is negated. And it can also be understood as the fact that the interaction between the photons, you have to understand that the photons are always moving the speed of light, and that they all have to keep up. Photons just can't go in one direction or go in a forward direction. They have to go in a forward direction. At some point in the cycle, they have to go left, and they have to go back, and they have to go around. They have to keep staying with the school. And every photon has to stay with the school, or it would be, the velocity alone would leave it way behind. And so that forced participation, the fact that the movement has to be incrementally, each photon has to carry its bit of that change, would negate any differential. So the fact is, matter, the momentum that matter has is an illusion. And what it really represents is the change in the pattern of the photons. The photons are changed in their pattern, their orientation, again, we're back to the ellipse argument. They have, the ellipses are in the same direction. And that changes how much they can be affected in that direction, exactly proportional to their velocity. So the faster they go, the less they can be affected in the direction that they're moving. It's the simplest way to put it, I think. But anyway, it's not a, the theory is viable, and if one accepts the premises of a particle photon-based mechanism. If it's understood as that, there's no problem understanding why matter is fundamentally changed when you move it, and why it wouldn't be affected. Photons would not be affected by interactions where their force is direct. I guess another way to put this is, if we argue that there's a rule that free fish can't interact with free fish, if we just make the rule, you can understand that the more of something's matter, that is more of the fish are moving in just one direction, let's say. They tend to be moving in one direction. So the higher percentage of the time they're spending in one direction. One could argue that a free fish coming in the opposite direction would essentially be interacting with free fish. Because even though these are fish that were matter, they're spending so much time in movement in one direction, they're essentially free. So that would be a way of understanding it, is that as the matter goes faster and faster, it becomes less material, as it's spending more of its time acting like free photons. Yeah. Good enough. Okay, like gravity, magnetic attraction and repulsion is created by variations in photonic pressure. With magnetism, the pressure is of two characteristic types created inversely by the poles, and which causes changes in directional momentum of the electrons and in turn the atoms. So you could argue that magnetism is doing the same thing. It's a net pressure gradient, and that you could understand it as that what goes into, what goes into the north side and the south side. So what goes into the north side in terms of the photonic pressure comes out. Okay, so whatever, maybe slight directional changes, who knows, but it comes out changed. So it goes in an X state and comes out in a Y state. So it's still the same kind of thing. It's a free photon, it's a fish, but now it's changed. And you could argue that polarization might be part of that change. So you could argue that the fish is swimming this way when it goes into the north side of a magnet, and it comes out this way on the south side of the magnet. And you could say that the south side does exactly the opposite. It goes in this way and it comes out that way. and that the two sides are affected by exactly the opposite fish. So the fish the north side is producing, the polarized this way, are the ones that the south side of the magnet is sensitive to, and the north side of the magnet is sensitive to the fish going this way that are being produced by the south side. And so it essentially just doubles what you might consider gravity, and it creates the idea of a repulsive force, because now you can have the situation where the side producing just flat fish, which is doubling essentially the pressure, is affecting now the north, or the opposite pole, that is twice as sensitive to those kind of fish, and now is, end up going to be repulsed. And so it's basically the same as gravity, except you're just adding the element of having two configurations with opposite sensitivities. Yeah, it's pretty simple. So it's not that much more complicated, and it might, I can't say for sure that polarization is the factor that creates the X and Y, that is the factor that creates the two types of photons, but it might well be. There's nothing on its face to say that's the wrong answer, because these aren't photons we can detect, because they're not in a period or frequency, and so there's no electrons with which we can detect them with, beyond matter being affected by gravity or matter being affected by magnetism. So we can only test them when they're actually functioning, and that makes it a little difficult to test them, because the test is basically on something that is in its native state or its neutral state, not a special state. Yeah, so anyway, that will take a longer video. Anyway, in both gravity and magnetism, no energy is transferred, so that's really important to understand. These aren't photons that are absorbed and then some other photon is emitted. These photons merely exchange directional orientation information. So again, it's like the perfect universe made out of just cue balls. It would bounce and bounce forever. All the balls would just bounce into each other, and there would be no heat, there'd be no anything. There would just be different directions that they move in. The chaos level would be maintained exactly the same, and it would do nothing if the balls didn't stick together or do something else to change the mechanics of it. It would just be a change in direction. And although it would appear energetic, there's no energy being transferred. There's just directional information being transferred. There's no energy being added. Okay. The only thing altered is directional momentum, the direction of pre-existing and pressure-regulated internal velocities. So again, the electrons have a shape to their orbit. Let's say they have the size to their orbit, and they have orientation to an atom and to other atoms, and all of those things can be altered or changed based on interaction with these free or unwavelengthed photons. Alright, number 9. The wavelength and frequency of a photon are a manifestation of period, impacts per second of time, and impacts per a period of time, and not a property of individual photons. So all the photons are the same photon. So a radio photon is the same as a cosmic ray photon, as a ultraviolet light photon. They're all exactly the same photons, and the only thing that's changed is how the period between their arrival. And so there is no frequency or wavelength information in the actual photon. The photons must be received as a pair to be interpreted as a specific kind of photon. And so, this will have to be subject to proof. There are some people who argue that they somehow have tested or tasted a single photon, that they somehow know how to detect a single photon. I'd say they have no way to do that. The only way we can see or even know of the existence of a photon is based on its interaction with an electron, which is a very complex and immensely large structure compared to a photon, a single photon. And so we're just inferring oneness. There would be no way for us to know 1 from 2 from 3. We can only know an amount sufficient to cause an effect in electrons. And we can call the smallest effect we can detect 1, but we're just calling it 1. We don't have proof of 1. So that'll take some arguing, I suppose. But this is a fundamental part of quantum mechanics, and the rest of it is the idea of establishing this wavelength and frequency as being actual things the photon is, rather than understanding them as just being manifestations of how often photons are arriving, or how often they were produced. Same difference, but and this is the nature of red shifting, and the rest of it is you're not changing the energy of what's moving, you're changing how many are in a given period of time. And clearly, to change how many, you're usually going to have to expel some somewhere to change that, or else you have to be moving away or towards something to change the time interval of their creation, and or the time interval with which you receive them. If I'm moving away from this camera, the number of photons I would be receiving would be reduced because of the fact that I am moving away from the source, let's say, of the photons. So there would be less of them for a period of time. So period is the only relevant manifestation of the production of photons. How regular the distance is between the arrival time of a photon is the thing that will dictate whether you will tip over the electron, whether you will be poking it consistent with its pre-existing vibration. Again, back to the argument, you can understand if a tree is swaying in the wind and you want to try to push the tree over, what you do is you push when the tree is moving in the same direction as the wind is blowing, and then you wait for it to spring back, and then you push again, and that way you can push the tree over with the help of the wind. And that the electrons are functioning the same way, so they have a vulnerability to photons that come in the right period, but they have no vulnerability to photons that are coming randomly or without a consistent pattern for which they're vulnerable. Alright, so that's probably enough for this video. So that's the beginning, and then we'll go into more detail into these patches of stuff, and we will try to find specific elements and theories that we will dispute, and claims that we will make, and predictions we will make, and attempt to find places where we can find proofs that can be established, or where we can find established proofs that we can unprove through some mechanism. But all I can do is argue for the logic of this model compared to models that say the space itself has a whole superstructure in it that's altered and changed by the conditions of matter. And I would say that the great thing about recognizing these photons as being the real mechanism of the universe is that you can unify gravity and magnetism, and I have to get to electricity, but that you can unify all of these functions of the material objects by recognizing that all the interactions are fundamentally between photons and electrons, and not between photons and bent space. Yeah. So, till next time.